This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply located in Dayton, Ohio, exclusive distributor of Jen Allen templates and Put a Lid on It t-shirts. We are a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network. Find all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs, including the largest stock of GR pottery forms at cornellstudiosupply.com. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters, by potters.
A special thank you to the Archie Bray Foundation for sponsoring this episode of Tales of the Red Clay Rambler. The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. To place your order, call us at 406-442-2521 or order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 528 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today, Malene Barnett returns for an interview about her new book, Crafted Kinship, Inside the Creative Practice of Contemporary Black Caribbean Makers. In our interview, we talk about Black cultural memory, her process for interviewing and building an archive of over 60 Caribbean artists, and the influence of Caribbean material culture around the world. The book will be published by Artisan Books on October the 29th, and it will be widely available wherever fine books are sold. For more information, you can check out malenebarnett.com. I wanted to take a minute and highlight a few friends of the podcast that need help recovering from Hurricane Helene. Joy Tanner and Will Baker from Woodsong Pottery were affected by flooding of their studio and kilns in Bakersville, North Carolina. You can help them get back on their feet by donating to their GoFundMe campaign, which I've linked to the show notes for this episode. Also wanted to mention that artist and entrepreneur Josh Kopas's businesses were severely affected by catastrophic flooding. You can help him rebuild the hotel at the Old Marshall Jail and Zadie's Market, which are core anchor businesses for the Marshall community, by donating to his GoFundMe campaign, which will be in the show notes. If you'd also like to volunteer your time, they need help cleaning up, and you can also make direct contributions to other businesses in Marshall by visiting helpmarshall.org. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Let's start by talking about the title, Crafted Kinship. Can you talk about what it means to you and why you wanted to engage the bigger community around the idea of crafted kinship?
Yeah, I was really thinking about process and making, and the idea of how makers are literally crafting a kinship to a space that we were forced to create a connection to. And that space is the Caribbean, right? So, I was thinking about all the artists, the designers, the craftspeople, like all of us who were, whether we were making objects, making space, how we were developing our creative practices through this history and through a lens that is not really talked about a lot. And, even the title, because I think about that title, Crafted Kinship, how it could apply to anybody. But I'm really focused on this region because it's my heritage and it's the work that I'm curious about, like the space that I'm really curious about because of my family history. And so I wanted to bring together a community of makers who are also thinking about their creative practice from that perspective as well.
For the process of the book, you had a Fulbright and then lived in Jamaica. Was it a whole year that you lived there?
It was for 10 months I lived in Jamaica, so it felt like a year.
Can you talk about just getting the Fulbright and sort of that process of setting up a home base in Jamaica and then how you did the research?
Sure. Well, I was in grad school at Tyler School of Art and Architecture. And during my time there, I was doing research on African Jamaican ceramics. And then, of course, it was like a broader topic of just really exploring the region, the Caribbean, through the lens of clay. And, it's funny, a classmate said to me, like, Malene, your research, it would apply great for a Fulbright. And I was shocked because I always thought Fulbright was this thing for, people who have their doctorates or, scholarly work. And I didn't realize that they support artists. And, my classmate was like, no, because he did one and he explained and shared the process. So then I got to thinking, I was like, okay, I'm going to apply. And the good thing is that Tyler has a department that really supports grants like a Fulbright and others. So I was able to have an advisor and different mentors with the application process, which is very intense. There's a lot of rewrites, revisions. It was, pretty intense process just to, try to create a proposal which is based on what you want to do. So there's no direction of, oh, it has to be this way, it has to be that way. It's really focused on your interests and desires. And then you have to find an institution to support this idea that you have. So that meant finding whether it was a school or, a center or something. So I found I was able to connect with a lecturer at Edna Manley College, which is the Edna Manley College School of Performing Arts. I was able to connect with a lecturer there and then the dean, and they loved the idea. And they hadn't had a Fulbright who was doing the work that I was doing. And so they were very interested. And so then I was the visiting artist at Edna Manley College. And that's where I was able to make work as well as interview and different makers, potters from different levels, um, contemporary to traditional. And I was able to travel the island and, meet different potters and learn about the different techniques and how they were working with this material. So it was a very heartfelt, inspirational experience. And like with any experience, it had its challenges, but it also taught me about I could be in this space and just be. And which was really great being in that environment. It was always my dream to be in the Caribbean for an extended period of time. My father's from Jamaica and my mother's from St. Vincent. And so for me, it was like a homecoming. And I look forward to continuing to explore the country more and the region as a whole more.
You interviewed 60, I guess you probably interviewed even more than 60, but in the book there are 60 folks. And it was interesting to see the blend between clay, wood, and fibers. But what was also interesting is how they self-defined. So you even talked about how the label based on what you do is not as common as just saying you're a multidisciplinary artist. Did you find any trends in terms of the way people approached material itself in their career?
I mean, I thought there was some overlaps on techniques of processes. And then of course, like for example, or even I should say subject matter. Like hair was a popular concept among some of the makers in there. Sonia Clark, who's in the book, has been, investigating hair for many decades now, actually. I just saw her retrospective show at the Mad Museum. And then like Shaniqua, who's a weaver, is also exploring hair. And then Chelsea is also exploring hair, but using clay. So that was a common theme. And then there's cyanotype, using that process. Andrea Chung was using that as well as Terry Body. So there was some overlapping in process technique and even themes, of course, because that was one of the questions, what themes in your work are you trying to address, whether it was the African origin stories, whether it was sustainability, whether it was a materiality. So you'll definitely, and that's what I wanted to show, like how we are all approaching these themes and materials, but the results are multifaceted, right? And so it just shows that, you could do cyanotype then and I could do cyanotype and it's going to look different. You could weave and I could weave and it's going to look different, and so on. But that's what I wanted people to see, the multiplicity of the outcomes and to inspire, encourage them to like dig deeper into these processes, subject matters, but also put their own perspective on it.
I really like how you listed where people were born, then where they lived or had their career, because you got to see a pattern of migration, both from Africa to the Caribbean, but also sometimes back, like people based in London. There was a weaver, Manjak weaver, Johanna Bramble, that's in Senegal. Like, I thought that story of migration back and forth was interesting because then you could see it in the work. So, can you talk about how migration itself, both forced migration through the slave trade and then sort of the contemporary era of migration for opportunity and for art jobs, how do you think that's shaping people's work?
Well, I think it's, I'm glad that you brought up those points because I wanted to also show how, Caribbean people and the culture is beyond just the actual region and that we have migrated all over the world. And, there was a period in, I think it was the 60s or 50s or 60s when like Senghor, president of Senegal, had back, called back the community, the Black diaspora to come home. And then so, many of the French speaking islands took that opportunity and went to Senegal. Um, Many of us, of course, we went to the colonizers' countries. Like we went to France, we went to England, we came to America. So the diaspora is very large in these areas because of the systemic connection of one, how we were educated, the opportunities, is it depending on where you had your passport from. It's like, oh, does it make sense to go to US? Does it make sense to go to Europe? Where is it going to be a little easier? And then, of course, you have to also consider, for example, in England with the Windrush generation, who went to England with the ideas that they were going to be supported through work, which never happened. So then you had a whole flux of Caribbean people going there. And so what happened, of course, is that we set up community. We crafted a kinship again to these lands, right? And so I wanted people to see that yes, we are coming from this area, but we are all over and we continue to bring our culture and our experience through our creative practices.
Yeah, and I think the book traces some aesthetic lineages that are really interesting. You talk about how the book is really an archive. So there are people that have passed and then also people that are working contemporary. And God, Athea
Althea
McNish.
McNish.
Yeah,
Yes,
I knew that. I knew those patterns. I didn't know that it was her, though.
right.
So,
Yeah.
can you talk about why it's important to pay homage to the ancestors, both the people and the aesthetics that they created, and in her case, dispersed through the UK and worldwide?
That's right. I really wanted to create space for the ancestors because of them we are here and because of them we're doing the work. And even the book is dedicated to many of the ancestors. And then in the intro, when you open the book, those end papers are the words from each maker who they dedicate their practice to. Some people are ancestors and some are living. And so it was important for me to create that space. So just like what you're sharing is like we may be familiar with some of their work, but we weren't able to make the connection. And I really wanted people to connect the work and the person. And, many people didn't know she's from Trinidad. I mean, that's where she was from. And she made a name for herself in the UK, but of course, she didn't get her flowers like she should have during her time. And, culturally, life is it's a circular experience. So even though she may not be with us living, her work continues to live within us.
Is it wheat fields? I can't remember the name of the pattern, but it became like a global sensation. I loved in the book that the woman that had written about her said that it was in production from 1960 to 1970. So it was really nice to hear the person write about it. I think that person was a curator at the
That's right,
V&A.
Christine.
Can you talk a little bit about who you collaborated with and what that process was?
Yeah, it definitely was a collaboration. It was also a way for me to build a community around this subject matter. I was really important for me to not only highlight the makers as well as ancestors, but it's also the people who have been doing scholarly work around this type of, I should say, the creative practices of contemporary Black Caribbean makers. So I wanted to have a blend of the voice of the actual makers as well as some essays. And I want it to be accessible and approachable. So even if you know you feel that, because I know at times scholarly work could be intimidating for some, and I wanted to break that barrier and show how when it's all together, how there's this synergy between like seeing the maker's work, then reading about a scholar who's talking about makers in the book. So then you could go back and reference them right there in the book. And which I really love, because Michelle Wilkinson, who's at the Smithsonian, she does that in her essay. She references many of the makers who are featured in the book, so it's a great way to constantly, reference and go back, which is what I want people to do. And the idea of the book is not just like a one-time read. It's a book that you're going to have to continue to go back, and hopefully it will be part of, maybe it's a part of a research paper, maybe it's a part of a project that you're working on. It's going to inspire you, if you are a maker, to start thinking about your practice from a different perspective. And so there's all these multi-layer stories and experiences, because the Black diaspora experience is a multi-layered experience. So the book was created in that sense, understanding that there are a lot of layers to pull back and then a lot of layers to dig through.
You had a similar set of questions that you asked most of the artists. And one of the ones that I think is at the core of the book is about Black cultural memory. And this is something that you asked in some form to a lot of the artists. And I want to ask you the question you asked them. What does cultural memory mean to diasporic people, or in the context of Black Caribbeanness? Can you just talk about this idea of cultural memory and what that means to you as a maker?
Yeah, cultural memory is really important because it's how we are, when tapping into those memories, whether it's from childhood, whether it's from our current state, that how the way I'm doing it is I'm remembering things based through objects, right? Through objects that my mother has collected from St. Vincent, right? Um, and sometimes it's through being in a space. So whether I'm in the Caribbean, whether I'm in West Africa, there's this memory that comes back based on just cultural connection. It's not necessarily written down in a book saying that this is how things were. There is this connection that I may not know specific, but there's no coincidence that I'm carving clay the way I am, because I know I'm tapping into cultural memory when I look at my brothers and sisters, say in Ghana or Nigeria or Burkina Faso, and their pots are so similar, right? So that's the cultural memory that I am holding on to. And using that, because we don't have the exact written history, the cultural memory becomes the tool and source of how we build from our African origins. And so it's a constant tapping back. And that origin story, origin story, we know source is the continent, but we also know how that same cultural tradition was passed down and carried through the Caribbean, as well as we are based, those of us who are based in the US or Europe or, wherever, it's still within us. So we're still tapping into the cultural memory.
I'm very interested in how art is the history, how like the art object, you said that you're tapping into cultural memory through objects. But if you go into a curated exhibition, that then is the memory that you're seeing through the objects. So is there any plan to sort of make this into an exhibition or some way in which you could get all these different people's objects in one place?
That is a goal, Ben, to have an exhibition. So I'm going to put it out so any curators or institutions who are interested in, having the Crafted Kinship exhibition, it is very much a goal of this project because again, I want people not only just to read the work, but I also want them to see it as a collective. And seeing as a collective is going to create another experience.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
Hey folks, Sunshine Cobb here, ceramic artist and current resident coordinator at the Bray. I'm excited to announce that our application portal is now open for our 2025 residency cohort. Applications are due by December 19th, 2024. For details on all our residencies available, head to archibray.org/residencies. Please help us spread the word about this amazing new opportunity at the Bray. Thanks so much.
There was so much of the work that I had never thought about materials in that way. I'm thinking of Andrea Chung, who does everything. Like, it's amazing to see the amount of different work that she does. But one of the projects that she did is that she takes sugar and then makes it into a liquid and cast objects that were then in installations in a space. For one, I love the idea of sugar because that's so much about the economic production of the Caribbean, but also it's a beautiful substance. So can you talk about her work and that work specifically? Like, what do you think that means for the greater whole of Caribbean art?
Well, I think that it just shows that our materials aren't limited to paint and pastels or, these quote unquote more, I should say, traditional Western materials, that because we're from that region, the idea of working with working with what you have, as well as tapping into the landscape of the region is our toolkit. And, an artist like Andrea is just showing us that what's possible, that you could still make art with purpose and intention using materials that are actually deeply embedded into the history of that space. And, she's one of many who are thinking in that way. And that's why I wanted people to see, again, those possibilities that we need to explore beyond our traditional palette of what we've been conditioned to work with. Because as Caribbean people, specifically, the idea of having those tools like paint and paintbrush, we didn't have access on many levels. So it's really beautiful to see the work in a contemporary setting, thinking in that way. It's not that we don't have access to those materials now. It's that we're choosing. We have the right to choose not to use them to share our story. And I think our story is different in that way, that those materials that we think of to make art don't necessarily go with our story. So it's really showing how the work and the material and the process are just as important as the final outcome.
How did you put together the list of artists that you wanted to talk to?
It was hard. Because the thing is, this is just the beginning of a conversation, right? There are so many contemporary Black Caribbean makers out there who are doing amazing work. But one of the things I had to do was I had to really edit and fine tune based on these questions, based on these themes in the book, The Threads of Kinship, which it really explains what those themes are. And so I had to really fit, who was really talking about, spirituality in their work, right? Who is really focused on material. So that's how I had a long list, and then it was about, okay, how do I edit down, because we're not making a 600-page book because it could have been that way. But of course, it got down to the list that the final cut, I should say. It did get down, of course. And of course, there were people that I wanted that weren't able to make it for whatever reasons. And then I just look at this as the first conversation of many, because the next volume, I'm putting it out to the universe. There will be another volume. And because I believe that this is just the beginning of a conversation, and conversations are to be continued. There's no end.
One of the threads of kinship that you talk about is spirituality. There was an artist, a Haitian artist, Fabiola Jean Louis. Their work is amazing for the religious aspect, but also just the detail-oriented, obsessive texturing of the figure in the figure. So I really appreciate that you turned me on to artists like her that I would not have known about. But can you talk about sort of the spiritual or religious aspects that came up as you talk to people?
Well, I think it was interesting because people were tapping into spirituality from different ways. Some were connecting it to like the Yoruba culture that was, again, that was brought over to the Caribbean. I know Fabiola specifically is focused on, the Haitian experience because she's Haitian. And then I'm sorry. Oh God, Leonardo. I was just sorry. There's another artist who also really taps into spirituality in his work, Leonardo. And so it was everybody was doing it in a different way. So Fabiola she was looking at it, I would say, from both the materiality of the process, to your point, looking at verdive, these applique, spiritual cloths, from Haiti, but sorry, how they're decorated. There's a lot of sequins and hand sewing that's involved, and every detail and process is important, just as important as the actual finished piece. And so she's using some of that process, I would say, and material in her work, and you start to see the connection, right? Spirituality is what grounds us daily, not just in our creative practice, but in our lives. And so that's just part of the experience. And so everybody was coming from it from a different way, but some, of course, are more pronounced than others in their creative practice. And those are a few that you mentioned. Fabiola was one of them.
Well, one of the other threads that you ask people about is the relationship between art, design, and craft. And you set it up very interesting in the intro, where you talked about the delineation between these is really kind of a colonial mindset. It's kind of a divide and conquer way of thinking. Can you talk a little bit more about the way you personally think about it? Because you've had a life in design, a life in art, but really it's your mind, it's your hands, it's still you. So whether it's sold through a design store or sold through a gallery, it's still your creative production. So can you talk about how you think about those three things?
I put them in conversation, all three of them. I'm constantly trying to figure out how to blur those lines, because I will use clay, which again is a material that many don't respect in a larger sense of like contemporary art. Of course, now I know it's getting more support and awareness and love. But traditionally, it hasn't been. It's been in its own category. But I also love fibers, and I also love to sculpt. I also love to design objects. So for me, all of those things go into the work that I make. So I try to think about it as this whole experience that I can't separate. But the challenge is when it's time to say sell, or be a part of an exhibition, or these type of experiences that have already segmented the way we are looking at art. That's where the separations start to happen, where it's like, is it craft, is it art, is it design, should it be there? But to your point, I made it. This is the story that I'm sharing, yes, these are the materials, these are the processes, and that's what should matter. And if it fits in line with the theme, it doesn't matter how it was made, what was used. It's about what was the intention behind the work? And is it a work that's going to bring people together to be curious, to start thinking about how they're living differently, that particular community, that experience? And that's what's really important to me. And so I try to share that and bring that out in my work when I talk about it. And, of course, there's certain themes that are important to me and materials, but I'm not going to change the way I make work in order to fit into quote unquote these categories that were set up for us. And so the idea of, blurring the lines is it's really, what's the word I'm looking for? It's really important to me that I continue to have those conversations around it and ask other makers so we can converse about it, because I don't think there's a lot of, say, public discussion around that. It's more private when those, asking about whether, you know, you're blurring those lines, or should they be blurred? Should the lines between art, craft, and design be blurred? And what do you think about that?
Do you think that there's a big market for Caribbean design specifically in the Caribbean itself?
Yeah, very much so. There is a whole, I would say, Caribbeanness of way of being. It's funny, you may think because you're there, it's like take it for granted in a way because you're there in the region, but there is a way. There is a way. And I specifically in Jamaica, I think Jamaica is a great space where the work that is really tapping into the African origins of the way we make, whether it's through textile dyeing, weaving, and working in clay. Like these are all traditions that we still carry on since the creation of the country in a way. So I think there is, and the way we're living with the land, right? That is a part of us, our culture and heritage in the Caribbean, and just as Black people in the diaspora. Land, living with the land, respecting it and nurturing it is a part of that living. And it's not just about having, say, a pretty couch or, the paintings on the wall. The whole design of Caribbean is broader than just the objects that we are interacting with. And so that's why also in the book, I wanted to have people who are working in architecture and interior design to show that, all of this is a part of the making process. Space is just as important as the objects because we need a space to store those objects, right? Or to experience it. Whether it's a public outdoor space or an indoor space, it's all space. And so, yeah.
This is a good segue to talk about sustainability, which is something that a lot of the artists work with. And I think the Caribbean, because many of these nations are island nations, like global warming has a different reality for an island nation than it does for the US, which has a lot of landlocked states that really probably maybe don't care if sea level is rising. But beyond that, can you talk just about sustainability? Like, what was the conversation you were having with folks about sustainability in the people you interviewed?
I think the conversations were that sustainability was part of our heritage. It was something that we did all the time. It was never the term wasn't even something that was used. The word recycle. We were doing that since we were kids. Like you turn that bottle into something else. You turned it into a flower pot holder. I'm just making it up. But the idea of recycling and using local materials was what the Caribbean experience is and was. So it was a natural thing to think about it. Now being in this part of the world, say the US or Europe, where we're not able to be so much in touch with the land because of, living in the cities. I call them the concrete jungles and so there's less of being in connection with land. So then how do you create sustainable practices in your work? And that's where the challenge comes in, because culturally you grew up with that. That is what you did. And now the challenge is, how do you bring that into your practice? And many of the people are doing it through materials, right? Working with local material, locally sourced, whether it's from the Caribbean or not, even if they're ordering from another country, it's about locally sourced and sustainable, and woods, things that could materials that could be replenished in nature was really important. And then not and also not being connected to like this fast way of living and creating space. Like, if we're buying objects that we know that they're going to be there for 20 plus years and not just, turn it over. Oh, next year we got to change the whole decor or whatever. No, that's another way that some of the makers were talking about sustainable ways of living and being.
Yeah, and design, like going into a store and buying an object that you know will last, as you said, more than 20 years is so embedded in the ceramic process because ceramics are forever, unless you break them. But there was a furniture designer, I think the company name is BOA.
Oh, yes, BOA. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought that reading the profile on them was interesting because they talked about how they work in a modernist style. And they talked about how if you look at their work, some people would say, why is a Black Caribbean artist making modernist work? And what they said is like, modernism way predates Europe. Why do y'all think it's a European thing? Like clean, simple lines go back. I think they talked about Egyptian design. They basically talked about the precursors of what we think of as European modernism.
Yes.
And they specifically work a lot in furniture. So can you talk a little bit about their work and just this idea of modernists having a Eurocentric approach versus having kind of more of a global feeling?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a deep question and conversation because we've been fed this idea that, clean, simple lines is connected to European design. But when we look at even spaces in the Caribbean, even in West Africa, and in other parts of the continent, and I'm only going to speak on West Africa because I've had that experience, is that the houses are very simple and clean. And if we even go back to traditional, like mud architecture, say in Ghana or Mali, there is a very simplicity of the space, which is what we know as modern design. And we know that these spaces were, to Bo's point, predate any of these European establishments. So it's about changing the narrative and thinking about where's the origin story, which is why I bring it up in the book, that we do need to know more about these origin stories. And so, Boa's work is very simple, and she's about working with locally sourced materials, which is really important to her. And, she's in the Caribbean now creating a market for the work because there is a need for it, because we don't see a lot of furniture makers like her who are making. And so now when people do meet her and see that this is possible, oh, I can have this type of look. It's not that there are no furniture designers there. There are plenty. But again, it's about the style and aesthetic. And that aesthetic is definitely connected to a European sensibility. And so, and that's why, people like Boa, it's good to see to help change our perspective of who's making and why.
One of the folks that you interviewed or that you had write something that I thought was really smart was a collector, because I think who's buying the work is often who's archiving it because they're collecting, they're making a grouping of things. The collector Kenneth Montague, who's Jamaican but is Canadian, talked about the idea of collecting Black art. And he says this: what is really needed, though, are more Black collectors. This way, the artistic legacies of both our ancestral and contemporary makers will be owned, preserved, and celebrated within our own communities. So can you talk about him, but also just the idea of keeping these objects in the Black community as a way of keeping your history?
Yeah, I mean, Kenneth is brilliant. I mean, he's really inspired many of us. He's been collecting for a long time, and he's created a space for his collection. I mean, Kenneth is a dentist by trade, but he learned about collecting from his father. I'm pretty sure it was his father who inspired him to start to look at art and collect it in a way. And it's really important for us. I agree with what he's saying, because it's really important for us as Black people and part of the community to protect our work. One is because we haven't had that opportunity prior to this. And now that we're in a place where we're relying on institutions to, protect and be custodians of our work, that when you rely on other communities to take care of what we could do on our own, then you cannot control what the outcomes are. We understand the importance of the work that we're making, and how this work is really changing the narrative around a particular period of time and a region. Because you have to understand, it was European artists who were sent to the Caribbean to create depictions of what it looked like for a long time. And that's what we had to rely on, those images. And so now we have an opportunity to change that narrative through our work. And so once we do that, the makers are doing it. We need people like Kenneth, many Kenneths, create the space so that we could, not just the current generation, but the generations behind us will be able to see what the truths were during this period of time, and really have a full, the whole story around the Caribbean experience, the Black experience in the Caribbean, through the makers who were actively rewriting the narrative of our time.
Well said. Can you wrap up by telling us about the book launch, which is going to come up at the end of October? How are people going to be able to get the book?
So the book is going to launch on October 29th. That's our pub date. And it is available online or wherever books are sold. The first launch party event is at Mad Museum on October 30th. They could follow me on Instagram and check the website for all the details. And then from there, there'll be the book tour launch, and I'll be traveling all over the country.
Well, safe travels. Thanks so much for doing the interview. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And also, I could add, Ben, that for those who pre-order from now until the pub date, I'm going to be offering a free download on how you could craft your own kinship, and I'll be teaching a virtual workshop on surface pattern design.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, leave your website so people can get in touch if they want to talk directly.
Sure. My website is MaleneBarnett.com. That's MaleneBarnett.com.
Great. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Malene Barnett for coming on the show, and I hope that you'll check out her new book, Crafted Kinship. I wanted to take a minute and thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and the Archie Bray Foundation. The Bray residencies have a deadline coming up December the 19th, so if you'd like to be a Bray resident, either in the summer or year-round, you can apply for that at the website. That's archiebray.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.